guys are awake. I'm not. You guys trust me, there's water in this, huh?
No.
I'm going to ask a favor before we get started. If you don't mind, I'm going to put one on each side. And I'm just asking if you would just sign your name to that, your email address, and just check if you're on Facebook. And if you get a friend request from me, don't say I don't know him. But this is because I've got a book coming out on June the 11th called 1963, The Year of Hope and Hostility. It is the first book ever to chronicle the year 1963, which is a bit of what I'll be talking about today. So we do that, but before I get started, I'm assuming everyone here has heard of the Civil Rights Movement, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's a yes, okay. What are civil rights?
Rights that should be afforded to everybody.
Very good. I would only add to that, rights in a democratic society, rights that everybody has agreed on that ought to be afforded to everyone.
Right.
Okay. But as we know in our history, even though those rights have been previously agreed upon, that everyone ought to have them, it's written in our Constitution. The preamble of the Constitution begins with "We the people." The ongoing struggle in America has always been who exactly comprises the we. That's been the ongoing American struggle. So I want to talk specifically about 1963A because I have a book coming out, but especially three of the chapters that deal with civil rights. But I also think they're very fascinating because they have an impact on who we are today. And so when we talk about the civil rights movement, we are talking about a period that begins roughly 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott and ends in 1968 with the death of Martin Luther King Jr. So that's really the period we're talking about this movement. It was not a systematic movement like they're playing this, and this more. It was a movement that took on various desegregation efforts in various cities, but it wasn't like a planned effort streamlined across the board. But 1963 is a very, very unique year. One, because it's 2013, so a lot of what I'm talking about now will be commemorating the 50th anniversary this year, which is why I wrote the book to come out in 2013. Marketing. So, to understand at least the civil rights aspect of 1963, there are three people that you must understand, at least know something about. One is former Alabama Governor George Wallace. The second is President John Kennedy. The third is Martin Luther King. So January 1963 begins, January 1st, in fact, 1963, is the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. End of 62, King is urging John Kennedy to not only acknowledge the Emancipation Proclamation, but also to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation because the issues primarily, and I'm going to use the language of that time, America's Negro citizens were still not being met, even though it was 9 years since the Supreme Court had, in a unanimous ruling, it issued Brown versus Board of Education. Kennedy is reluctant. Why? Kennedy is reluctant because in 1960 he runs against Richard Nixon in the closest election, one of it, not the closest election in our history. And part of Kennedy's success were those states in the southern region. So if he issues a second Emancipation Proclamation in 1963, he risks alienating part of his base for re-election the next year. Now, one of the things about history, when we talk about history, history is not what we should be. It's not looking at it through the moral lens that we hold today and say what someone ought to have done. When we look at history, it is what it is. It is what happened. And we can examine it, we can say, I don't agree with that, but we must always look at it dispassionately as to what actually happened. So, whatever one says about Kennedy's reluctance to step forward on civil rights, there were political considerations he was making. And politics is an amoral enterprise. It's not a moral enterprise. It's not an immoral enterprise. It is an amoral enterprise. Sometimes moral outcomes do happen in politics. The Emancipation Proclamation being one of them. But politics in general is not a moral enterprise. It is an amoral enterprise for individuals who are in that political arena making political decisions. It's an amoral enterprise. So that's why Kennedy's reluctant. Let me just add one more thing about Kennedy. He was also naive about the magnitude of civil rights. When he ran for president in 1960, he simply said, well, with a stroke of my pen, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. But with a stroke of his pen, he couldn't do those things. Those of you who have, everybody now, go to YouTube sometime. If you look up Malcolm X and UC Berkeley, there's a question and answer period where someone questions Malcolm about his criticism of Kennedy, and Malcolm, in his own Malcolm Wick, gives a very colorful answer, and so I invite you all to look at that when you get a chance. Now, the other interesting person of that year I just mentioned is former Alabama Governor George Wallace. Now, to understand George Wallace, I think we have to understand, it goes back to 1958, when Wallace, I'm sorry, does everybody know who George Wallace is? Everybody familiar with that name? Just say a hand. How many hands is familiar with that name? Okay. George Wallace, and we'll talk about him in a minute, probably, and I'll explain why later, the most influential politician of the last 50 years. And I'll explain why later, but if I can get to and get to the question and answer, some bright, enterprising person raise your hand and say, why is George Wallace the most influential politician of the last 50 years? And I'll explain. Now, Wallace runs for governor the first time in 1958. Those of you who are familiar with George Wallace might be surprised to know in 58 when he ran, he was endorsed by the NAACP. He also sat on the board of Tuskegee University, a historically black college, in the early 50s. He was a board trustee in the early 50s when he was state legislature. Anyway, Wallace lost in 58. And you know, after you lose an election, you have that recap. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? You know, why did we lose? Well, it turns out that Wallace, one of the reasons Wallace lost, he lost big, he was viewed as a moderate on issues of civil rights. In fact, the Klan had endorsed his opponent. And Wallace said, and I'm quoting, "Well, boys, no son of a bitch is ever going to out-nigger me again." That's an important statement to remember when we look forward about the behavior of George Wallace. It's an important statement to remember. Also, it really speaks to, remember I said how politics is amoral? It really speaks to how Wallace becomes probably one of the most grotesque political animals. I don't say that good or bad, he just is. It's one of the most grotesque political animals that we've had in the last 50 years. And I know you're dying to ask me why is he the most influential.
I know. When year did he get shot?
Well, that's like 70s. So, 72. Then the third person is Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, 63 is the beginning where Martin Luther King is becoming the Martin Luther King that we remember on television and holidays. Now I'll explain that later. I think we've gone overboard and not let Martin King be Martin King. I often tell people, if we let Martin King be Martin King after he died, we may not have a holiday in his honor, but we'd be a lot better people. So now, if you got a question about that, I'll explain that later too. So King is pushing Kennedy from the left. You got to do more on civil rights. Wallace now becomes governor in 62. In the 62, he's governor. Inauguration is January 63, and he's pulling from the right to make Alabama the epicenter of segregation. So Wallace famously, in his inaugural address, says, and I say today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Takes direct aim at Kennedy. It's like a 6,000-word speech, like Kennedy and the Harvard liberals. They are not going to come down here. I mean, it was Stonewall Jackson, Rebel Yell. He's actually standing in the same place that Jefferson Davis took the oath for the President of the Confederacy on 100 years, or more than 100 years earlier. So, really pointed at John Kennedy. Same night, Wallace gives this fiery speech. Kennedy, on the heels of the Emancipation Proclamation, is to stay in the Union. He gives 50 words to the cause of civil rights in very generic language. Why? He doesn't want to upset the South. So the lines are drawn right there. King on the left, Wallace on the right, and Kennedy trying to dance the dance in the middle. In April, you have the beginning of the Birmingham campaign. It's called Project C. Now, Birmingham comes on the heels of 1962. There was a campaign, a civil rights campaign in Albany, Georgia, that many view as a defeat for a king. However, Albany was not a king-led movement. Because what tended to happen was that these movements would start, and then they would call king, and because President followed king, he would come, and that would make it notoriety. But also coming with that was he would come, it becomes a king movement, because that was the name since the Montgomery bus boycott that people knew. It becomes a king movement. But they weren't really clear on what they really wanted, what they were really asking for. Also, there was a man there by the name of Jim Clark, who had actually studied nonviolent civil disobedience. He was the sheriff in Albany. And instead of being violent, he had arranged with other municipalities. They would arrest people, and then they would take them to other jails. They would take them quietly. King would be arrested, and then they also had people who would bail King out. So there was never a story. There was never any conflict. So Albany looked like a defeat for King because nothing was ever resolved. But Birmingham, first of all, Birmingham was a deliberate attempt. Something didn't just happen. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which King was a part of, met in '62 and said, we're going to take on Birmingham. That's the first difference. Birmingham was deliberate. And they called it Project C, C for confrontation. Project C, C standing for confrontation. And they had a real systematic approach to nonviolent civil disobedience to desegregate Birmingham. So, meanwhile, there's other factors that are going on during this time that some they didn't plan that actually worked very well for them. One, there was a mayoral race going on in Birmingham at the time between a man by the name of Albert Bothwell and the Public Safety Commissioner who goes by the name of Eugene Bull Connor. Anybody here heard of Bull Connor? Let me see your hands if you heard of Bull Connor. Okay, now, whatever you know or think of Bull Connor, I will say to you, Bull Connor was unquestionably one of the greatest allies the civil rights movement ever had. And I'll explain why. Bull Connor, and so so the Kennedy administration urged King not to do anything until let the mayoral race happen first. And then you can do the administration, but let the mayoral race happen. So they held off to the mayoral race. Well, Bothwell wins. And Bull Connor, this is the first thing. Bull Connor is an elected official. He's a head of public safety, which means he controls fire, police, emergency services. He controls all that. He's still an elected official because they were going to get rid of his seat as head of public safety